Hello everyone, and welcome. This is Mary Magnuson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the Universal Service Fund, Supporting Broadband in Rural Places. This month's webinar is co-sponsored by Blandin Foundation and the Minnesota Office of Broadband Development, and is one in a series of monthly webinars Blandin Foundation offers for our Blandin broadband communities, and open to anyone with an interest in using technology to improve community. Before we begin, I'll point to the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. To interact with us at any time during today's webinar, you can simply type your question or comment in the chat box. And now let's get started. Again, my name is Mary Magnuson, and I work here at Blandin Foundation, and I administer the Blandin Community Broadband Program. Joining me today is Ann Tracy of Tracy Information Systems, who I'm sure many of you know or at least have heard of. Ann has been working with the Blandin Broadband Initiative for a number of years. Most notably, she authors the Blandin on Broadband blog. Ann will introduce our guest speakers today. They are Jonathan Chambers, Chief of Policy and Strategy for the SEC, Joe Ferdoso, co-founder and COO of Mighty River LLC, a telecommunications consulting firm, Mary Messicomer, Technology Integration and Development and Outreach Facilitator for TIES, and Jennifer Nelson, Minnesota State Librarian. If you're used to being on these webinars, you'll see that oddly today we only have 2 people showing up under the presenters box on the attendee list, and that's because Ann and all 4 speakers are sitting in a room together today at the Minnesota Department of Education in Minneapolis. So they're all logged in under one name, but know that they're all there. And so Ann, take it away.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, we're all having a party here at the Minnesota Department of Education. It's kind of a treat. It's been a great treat for me because I have been following in the shadows of Jonathan and Joe all day. I have seen you give 2 presentations now on Universal Service Fund and TAP and ERate. It's been really interesting. I've learned something each time. I think people have had some really excellent questions. So I'm kind of excited to hear the presentation again to learn a little bit more. What I've really appreciated is that, well, you guys obviously know the deep details. You make it so accessible to everybody that's listening. So I hope everyone else will find that. And then I'm excited to hear Mary and Jen kind of, I don't know about respond, but I think at the state level what we do is kind of respond to what's happening at a federal level. So I'm excited to hear about that too. I thought I would start by introducing our 2 big national speakers to start off with, and let you guys kind of give your presentations, and then introduce Jen and Mary, who I know both of them and think so highly of them. So just without further ado, we've got Jonathan. I think that you're going to start. And Jonathan Chambers has been at the FCC since 2012 and works with FCC leadership to develop strategic plans and identify the agency's policy objectives. Prior to the FCC, he worked in the private sector for more than 15 years with companies in the startup phase in the telecommunications business. He also has an extensive experience working as a staff person in the U.S. Senate. Jonathan has a JD from Georgetown, an MA in International Affairs from Columbia, and a BA from Yale. And I'll quickly introduce Joe too, so that you guys can kind of, I've seen you smoothly transition already, so I'm going to let you guys do that. And then, there we go. We've got Joe Ferdoso from Mighty River. Is co-founder and CEO of Mighty River, which is founded by April and Joe Ferdoso, your wife, I believe, in 2014, and an advise and do company in the broadband infrastructure space. Through USF, Universal Service Administration Company, Mighty River provides fiber network construction expertise to states, school districts, and libraries throughout the country, meeting their need for affordable, scalable broadband. I'm kind of emphasizing that on purpose. In 2014, Joe completed a 7-year stint as president and CEO of MCNC, which operates the North Carolina Research and Education Network, providing broadband connectivity to most anchor institutions in North Carolina, and all of the K-20 public education, most research organizations, many nonprofit hospitals, and public health clinics. Also served as roles at Cisco, Turner Broadcasting, Walt Disney World, and several entities in the Olympic movement in 1999, and Special Olympics and World Summer Games. And I learned earlier that kind of brought you to our fair cities in the past. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go at it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. This is Jonathan Chambers, and I'll speak first, and then Joe will take over in a little bit. I am, as was just explained, held the position of Chief of the Office of Strategic Planning at the FCC. I run an office of a couple of dozen technologists and economists at the FCC. I'm an attorney. I'm the only attorney in the group. My role at the FCC is, I think this was, put it this way, when the new chairman of the FCC, a fellow named Tom Wheeler, he's now been there nearly 2 years, asked me to stay on at the FCC. I'd been there for a year and a half. He said, John, I've known you a long time. We've known each other for 25 years. He said, what I think the commission really needs is an institutional irritant. And I've known you so long, I know you're particularly good at that. So that has, in many respects, been my role, which is a nice way of saying I know how to be a pain in the ass. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about universal service in rural areas in particular, because we're trying to do some new things, and over the next 3 to 5 years, those new things we're trying to do will either work or we'll all go back to the old way of doing things in rural America. The FCC just recently announced that it was awarding, through a process that's been going on for a couple of years, amounts of money to the major price cap carriers in the country. In Minnesota, it's largely CenturyLink, and the price cap carriers, hope you're all familiar, are pretty much the old Bell operating system, plus some of the larger non-Bell companies like GTE and Sprint. The award of funds over a 5 to 6 year period is about $10 billion, and it is meant that with the money, the price cap carriers will build out a service of 10 megabit per second down and 1 megabit per second up to all of the so-called high-cost areas in their service territory. Offers were made to each of the price cap carriers on a statewide basis, and so the carriers either accepted the money and the obligations on a statewide basis, or they turned it down. Now, most of the carriers accepted the money, but in a few instances, there is still going to be money made available through a different process. And that money will be made available in areas where Verizon turned down most of the money that was offered to it, as well as some areas where there were participants in an FCC process called the Rural Broadband Experiment. So those that participated in the Rural Broadband Experiment and sought to offer broadband service had their areas carved out of the offer that was made to the price cap carriers. The rationale being there was a competitive interest in those areas. And so when you add it all up, the areas that are still sort of unbidden, it will be about $2 billion worth of funding that the FCC will put to an auction, a reverse auction. That is to say, we will seek entities, they might be carriers, they might be telephone co-ops, they might be electric co-ops, they might be community broadband providers, to bid in an auction to serve an area in exchange for the funding. And what that will do, and here's what sort of I'm getting, at least what to me will be the interesting part. we already know that where a price cap carrier has taken this offer of service, it will build a minimum of 10-1. What we're going to seek in the other areas of the country is a more robust service than 10-1. Based on the results of our rural broadband experiment, we saw a lot of interest in building fiber to the home, including fiber to the home in areas that are very sparsely populated. I know of examples around the country where entities are building fiber to the home where there may just be a couple of people, 2-3 homes per linear mile. And the reason some entities can do that is the economics are different depending on the entity that's building. So, for example, the economics for AT&T may not look the same as the economics for a rural electric co-op. Or the economics for Verizon may not look the same as the economics for a community broadband provider. What we will see over the next several years after we have run this auction process is we will see the results of offering funding to a single provider, an incumbent provider for service, and offering funding to alternate providers that participate in a competitive bidding process. And we will see whether we get better service, whether we get construction, whether we get a better level of service in terms of the quality of service, the speed of the service, or whether we get areas that don't get service at all. And that's really has been the traditional reason that universal service funding has not been put to competitive bidding. That is to say, the deal for 100 years has been that the incumbent would get a monopoly in their areas, and in exchange for that, they would be protected from competition, and they would receive, at least in the last couple of decades, they would receive subsidies to provide service. So what will be new in the next few years is a bit of an experiment. It's a carry-on of the so-called rural broadband experiment that we initiated a couple of years ago to see if communities will step up themselves where a service provider may be unwilling, to see if community-based organizations like co-ops will step up and build fiber to the home or other advanced services where it is considered uneconomic to do so by the major incumbent providers. And if communities step up, it could change the way the country views infrastructure investment for a long period to come. My own proposal, and I'll just speak for myself because it has not been adopted by the Commission, is that the way we would make funding available in the future would be that we would make CapEx funding available. That is to say, in the past, and in the offer that was made to the price cap carriers, an amount of money is provided as a subsidy on an ongoing basis to subsidize the difference between the cost of providing service and the revenue expected from the end users. We've modeled this out at the FCC over a period of years, and it's at least the view of the folks in my group that if you provide CapEx, even in a rural area, that there is sufficient revenue to be had from the end users to pay for the ongoing operations and maintenance. But the real stumbling block for building out infrastructure in rural areas is the capital expenditure required for building, say, along fiber down, if you're 10 miles away from the nearest internet exchange point, or 20 miles away, or 50 miles away. And that CapEx, if it's covered by the federal fund, will lead to greater interest in those who might serve rural areas. And that to me is really sort of the end goal. It again, it's my view and the view of the folks that I work with, that we ought to be able to get fiber deployments everywhere in the country, to every school, to every library, to every business, to every home. But that's the long-term investment piece. And it'll only prove itself out if communities are willing to step up, join together either in cooperatives or find somebody, a telephone co-op in the existing area or in a neighboring area, or an electric co-op, to do the work of constructing, maintenance, and operation of the networks. Now, if you're in an area where the price cap carrier accepted the funding, you should expect broadband to be built out to your area. It will not be the same as fiber to the home, but it will be a decent level of service. And in 5 years' time, the FCC, even in those areas, will go through the same competitive bidding process again. That is to say, we're going to have a competitive bidding process next year for some areas of the country, and in 5 years, we'll have that same process for other areas of the country. If one is interested in building out networks, but money isn't available now for residential broadband, there is another alternative, and this is what I'll turn over to Joe in a second. The FCC, in a couple of reform measures last year, changed the ERate program in some very substantial ways. And to me, the most substantial had to do with service in rural areas. So the FCC increased the amount of support available in the ERate program, up to $3.9 billion a year. We also made funding available in a new way for special construction to get to schools and libraries. We will pay the upfront costs of special construction. We will pay now not only our traditional share that's based on the poverty and the amount of rural territory in an area, but we will increase the amount we would pay up to an additional 10% if there is state participation as well. What that means in a rural area, which are oftentimes receive an 80% subsidy from our federal fund, is that now in cases a special construction build to a rural area, a rural school, a rural library, a wide area network amongst rural schools and libraries, could receive with state matching funds up to 100% of the special construction funds for fiber builds. We believe that that sort of thing will make broadband internet access affordable and available in schools and libraries in rural areas. And the first year for that kind of new program is the 2016 funding year. Applications of which begin in January of 2016. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to explain some more of...
Sorry, Chelsea,
yeah.
I see that Janet has a question that she's kind of asked twice here about why the shift from 10-1 for the original funding, and I don't know if we want to go. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me read the...
Why does CAP 2 require only 10-1?
So,
standard stuff.
Sure. So, in 2012, the FCC decided that this Connect America Fund program would be, that the speed would be set at 4-1. And a lot of work went into determining how the funding would be allocated amongst the price cap carriers. So that decision had largely been made prior to the time that the new chairman joined. The Chairman Wheeler joined the FCC nearly 2 years ago now, in November of 2013. And the decision to move to 10-1 rather than a higher standard was really one of getting the program going. It had been delayed. The work behind it had already been over a year behind schedule, and sort of moving the bar up from 4.1 to something higher was already at the time controversial. What we did try to do in preparing for it was we did run this rural broadband experiment to seek interest in other forms of build-out, other entrants, others than the traditional, the incumbent telephone companies. And we saw some interest. I mean, we saw a fair amount of interest. We received, I think there were 180 different bidders around the country. But I'd say it was not, at that time, sufficient interest to convince the whole commission. There are 5 commissioners at the FCC, and they're the ones that get the vote. It was not sufficient interest to convince enough people that we ought to abandon the path of making an offer to the incumbents. And to shift from 4.1 to 10.1 was viewed as the most that we could shift the funding and keep to the funding timetable, which was to get funding out this year and to have the funds run for 5 or 6 years, it turned out. I would say this: the 10.1 should be viewed as a temporary level of service, temporary meaning over the next few years. I would expect not only in the auction that we will run next year, but in the auction that would be run in several years' time, that the standard would be either 25.3 or a standard saying that it has to be a fiber-based service or fiber or a cable-based system capable of much higher than 10.1, higher than 25.3, capable of maybe 100 meg per second. So there was a decision made to do what was immediately possible, and that's why we ended up at 10.1 and not a higher. And sorry for the very long-winded explanation. There's a lot of back and forth over that decision.
No, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. And folks, again, this is Joe Ferdoso, and Ann did a great job of pronouncing a difficult Italian surname. And I'll start just by thanking everyone for attending the webinar. And my role in this is Jonathan transitioned to the changes in the modernization orders for the ERate program. And I'll dig into a little bit of details of the modernized ERate program. And there are some slides that I'll roughly follow. I'm really bad at talking to slides, so I'll warn all of you on the call for that. But if you look at this overall, if you look at the modernization effort, those of you that are in education or affiliated with libraries realize that the environment within our schools and our libraries has changed significantly over the period of time that the ERate program has been in effect for the 16, 17, now 18 years that the ERate program has been subsidizing and reimbursing applicants for broadband connectivity. And probably the most stark change is that rather than just getting base connectivity for several purposes to those facilities, our users are actively using and engaging with digital resources from the World Wide Web in a way that they had not been previously, and that is only increasing in the trend. They're bringing their own devices in. They are being issued devices if they are a school, if they are a student. The curriculum that teachers are presenting to our students is more and more digitally based, and there needed to be scalable connectivity to those applicant facilities in order to meet with demand. If ERate would have continued to take the philosophy that it had for the first 16 years, which was to reimburse applicants for monthly lit, fully managed service, and you looked overall at the bandwidth growth rates that our schools and libraries were experiencing, the fund would never be able to keep up with demand. There simply weren't enough options for our applicants to look at that were scalable in order for the fund and their own funding of the non-discount share to keep up with demand. We saw it all around the country, including in my home state of North Carolina, where the proliferation of digital content, the equity of access to education, particularly in North Carolina, our rural area access to online AP courses, was being hindered by a lack of infrastructure, and we needed to do something about that. So as we worked through, as the FCC and USAC worked through the modernization effort, a real stark change occurred, and that real stark change was we needed to move from this being a reimbursement program of kind of monthly services, what I would term the ERate ATM, where you would go and withdraw every month of what you needed to pay for your lit service, to something that was going to leave our applicants with a modicum of control over the infrastructure and would scale to the future. And that's exactly what modernization did. So if we can go to slide 3, I'll talk to you about the two forms very quickly of modernization, and Jonathan mentioned one of this. The first form is in lit services special construction. So this is for an applicant who wants to continue to bid monthly lit services as they do today. As you all know on the phone, if you've been an ERate applicant, it was very difficult. The program has always allowed an applicant to request capital to defray some of the capital costs of reaching an outlying facility, particularly with fiber infrastructure. But that capital was managed in a way that it was very difficult for both the service provider and the applicant to access. Under the old rules, if a project, let's say you had 5 schools in a district that were still on T1 connectivity and you wanted to meet the CETA standards of 1 megabit per student for upstream connectivity for that, and that required an upgrade from copper to fiber, if that was $1 million project, the way capital could be accessed under the program under the old rules was that if it was an 80% discount applicant, $800,000 of capital could be requested from the program, from the fund, but it would be paid out over 3 years. It would be amortized over 3 years, and the last 2 years would have to be requested individually, so it wasn't guaranteed. On the other end of the scale, the applicant, under the old special construction rules, would have to come up with their $200,000, the non-discount share, in the first year. So it was exactly the opposite of probably what it should be. Right? The applicant needed relief on their portion of the non-discount share, and the fund, while it was still under pressure financially, at least had resource to consider putting more capital up front or on an approved project. So the modernization order basically changed this. It said for capital projects of over $500,000 on an approved project, one where the applicant has determined and review has determined that the project is cost effective, the fund can front-end load the capital into the first year. So in my example of the $1 million project, the $800,000 could be paid to the applicant who passed it along to the service provider up front and paid it on the delivery of service. And the applicant could request to pay the non-discounted share, the $200,000 portion, over a 4-year period. The service provider could either accept or reject that request to pay over time. But if the applicant got more than one special construction bid, the applicant can use that as part of the decision criteria. If one service provider says yes, they will allow the non-discounted share to be paid over time, and another service provider says no. So those are the changes around the rules of lit service. Again, this is a fully managed lit service, probably what most of you are used to bidding today if you're an ERate applicant. But it allows you to gain capital to put new facility or substantially upgraded facility, likely fiber, to serving facilities that are not served by fiber today. Okay? So if we can skip to actually slide 5. Mary, thank you. Mm-hmm. The other way of acquiring dark fiber that is new, or the other thing that is new, the other eligible service that is new under the modernization order is for the applicant to acquire dark fiber. And there are 2 major ways to acquire dark fiber. You can do so on what's called an indefeasible right to use, or an IRU. An IRU is usually for a number of strands on a new or existing build over a number of miles, and it is priced, the capital lease portion is priced per strand mile. IRUs are usually in a number of years from 5 to 20 years, and the applicant can request a number of strands to serve its facilities, a number of strand miles to serve its facilities. The way that we are interpreting the order right now is that usually an IRU for an applicant would be limited to 2 to 4 strands. We can't think of a case, particularly today with DWDM gear and other things, where an applicant would need more than 4 strands. And there's also a rule in the modernization order that says the applicant has to put the strands that are IRU'd into service the first year that they are IRU'd. So that is going to be a limiting factor of that. The IRU also, as an eligible service, but just a straight Category 1 eligible service, includes maintenance of the fiber itself. So maintenance of the fiber, when I define that, for buried fiber, that is actually doing locates, it's riding the routes, it's making sure that the markers the markers are in place and are visible. It's rudimentary cut repair. It's kind of general splicing. For aerial fiber, it's riding the routes, making sure there's no kinks, making sure there's no issues, and shooting the fiber periodically to make sure that the capacity of the fiber is not being compromised in any way. Maintenance and operation should be bid as part of a fiber ownership. Under ERate interpretation, it should be bid separately from the IRU itself, but an applicant can give consideration to a provider who would provide both the fiber for the IRU and the maintenance and operations, and that's usually normal industry practice. I don't know of too many fiber owners, conduit system owners, who would allow a third party to come in and maintain fiber. This does not exclude the fact that an applicant can also build a managed service over fiber. I heard a lot when the order was passed that there were going to be a lot of districts and libraries that owned and operated their own fiber. And while there are some districts across the country that are fully capable of doing that and have technology staff, they are not the norm. They are kind of the exception to the rule. And so you can bid for a Category 1 managed service over that fiber. Now let me tell you some of the things we're going to be looking for an entity or an applicant that bids dark fiber also with a managed service. When we look at those managed service bids, we've done a lot of talking to industry analysts, and we know that capital cost recovery on a usual monthly lit service makes up somewhere between 45 and 65% of the monthly recurring cost. So we would expect that managed service to look something like a typical lit service cost without the bandwidth cap. So the managed service would be for all the way to the peak of the gear that is used, the routing gear and the optoelectronic gear that is used to both light and manage the service over the fiber. And we would expect to see a 45 to 65% discount over the normal monthly recurring cost of a lit service. So that's what we're going to be looking for upon review. The second way to acquire dark fiber is through a self-build. You may wonder on the slide why we will only allow a 2 or a 4 strand IRU, but we would allow a minimum of a 12. We would allow a maximum of a 12 strand build. Well, we talked to the fiber manufacturers. We talked to Corning. We talked to CommScope and others, and they told us that to manufacture a 2 or a 4 strand cable was more expensive than manufacturing a 12 strand cable. So that's why we would look at a 12 strand build. Again, fiber maintenance and operations would apply here. The applicants can separately bid that, and they can also bid a managed service over this over the fiber strand. I think the biggest thing here with the dark fiber options, as most of you have read in the order, that the applicant must bid a comparable lit service and do a total cost of ownership comparison between the lit service and the dark fiber option and then decide which is most cost effective over time. The applicant determines the amount of time of the cost comparison. A reasonable amount of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years. If it's an IRU, it may be the length of the IRU to do the cost comparison. And you must fully load the cost of the dark fiber. You must consider annual maintenance and operation, equipment refresh, and if you're going to do a managed service over that fiber, include the cost of the managed service in that cost comparison to compare it to the lit. A lot of folks have asked about the state match, and Jonathan mentioned that, so I'll mention it quickly, and then we'll go through a couple of examples briefly, and then I'll hand it over to Jen and to Mary. But the state match is for the first 2 years of the dark fiber eligibility program and the first 2 years of the order. If states have dedicated funds for broadband infrastructure for applicants, they can get a dollar-for-dollar match up to 10% of the project cost from the fund. So in effect, state dollars can be matched up to 10% of the project cost with a 10% rise in their effective discount rate. So I don't know if that would give rise to any questions. Minnesota has some existing funding that may be able to be repurposed for this, or there may be some appetite for new funds for broadband infrastructure for applicants that would receive the one-to-one match. The best thing I can tell you on the one-to-one match is that I am part of a team, a large team of 2 people. Dana Schaefer, who's the Deputy Managing Director of the FCC, and I are traveling the country talking about the new modernized rules to folks. And if you have questions about the state match, both Mary and Jen now have our contact information, and we would be happy to answer any questions and bring any issues that we can't answer forward directly. So let's go to page 8, Mary, and or slide 8. Folks have asked us what parts of a network scheme or a network connectivity ecosystem for an applicant would be eligible. If you look at the drawing that's up on the screen now, this is kind of a district WAN, typical kind of district WAN, or now with libraries being able to be served by the same circuits as schools and be eligible, could be a combination network of schools and libraries. That local WAN circuit would be eligible for a dark fiber bid and the cost comparison, but also the circuit from the district hub to the aggregation network, if you're using an aggregation network, or the internet drop, would be eligible for comparison. So next drawing. A lot of states either use district hubs or regional hubs and go directly to the internet from those. You can see there are 3 types of circuits. The district WAN circuit or the local WAN circuit would be one. The aggregation hub or the district hub to the regional aggregation hub, and then from the regional aggregation hub to the internet drop point to the internet drain would all be things that you could look at and do a comparison of dark versus lit. And then the last one I'll show you is there are a lot of DIA circuits, particularly in rural areas. Both the local loop circuit to the CO or POP and from the CO or POP to the internet drain would be eligible. Usually from the CO to the POP, the provider is doing mixing traffic between eligible and ineligible entities, so there likely would be a cost allocation on that. And then my final slide, we've been asked a lot about the timing of this. Let me tell you, if you're an applicant and you expect to get a good dark fiber bid using just the minimum 28 days of having the RFP out on the street after the 470's filed, you are not living in this world. This is something that you have to think about now and probably extend your thinking of getting a good RFP for a period of time that looks something like 60 to 90 days. There is a lot of research that needs to be done, particularly on a new build. The provider has to consider, or the builder has to consider things like local franchise fees, rights-of-way access, railroad crossings, all of the fun things that we get to do, pole attachments, environmental things. You know, we don't want to hurt any snail darters or anything like that while we're building fiber, even though in 99.9% of the cases we're using already disrupted right-of-way. It still doesn't matter. You need to look at these things. So we've done our best to kind of put out a timeline that you'll see repeated as we do ERate applicant training in the fall. But again, major purpose of this is that we knew that the fund could never keep up with demand, and we wanted to give applicants options so that they could get scalable broadband. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I am going to do quick introductions now to our local state folks here and let you guys take it away. I'm going to start with Mary Meiscomer with the Technology Integration Development and Outreach Facilitator for TIES, and Mary has been with TIES for 4 years. Prior to that, Mary was the Network Coordinator for Northwest Links in Northwest Minnesota. She has also served as a Senior Technology Planner for the Minnesota Department of Education. Mary has been Minnesota's ERate Coordinator for schools since 1998. Wow. Mary, you are the go-to person, I think, and have been obviously for quite a while. She has a degree in communications from St. Catherine University. She is past president of the Information and Technology Educators of Minnesota, ITEM. And we also have Jennifer Nelson, Minnesota State Librarian at the Department of Education. Jennifer is the Director and State Librarian for the Minnesota Department of Education, serving in this position for 2 years. She teaches as adjunct faculty member at the St. Catherine University in their Graduate School of Information Management and Library Studies. Jennifer works as a senior grant writer for projects for Pride in Living. She has extensive experience working with digital inclusion, including with immigrant and communities for both Hennepin and Minneapolis libraries. She has an MA in Library and Information Studies from the University of Wisconsin. So I will let you two take her away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is Mary Messicomer, and I'll start us off. What Jen and I wanted to talk about today is how broadband is procured and how that works in Minnesota for schools and libraries. So we're going to talk to you about how Minnesota schools and libraries are organized when it comes to purchasing internet access, how some state funding supports schools and libraries after E-rate discounts are applied, and some of the challenges we face when moving to partner with other organizations while working within the E-rate program. So just to give you a little background about schools in Minnesota, I've got some statistics showing here. I won't read them for you because you can see them on the slide. But I want you to know that the majority of standard K-12 school districts in Minnesota are organized in telecommunications regions, or they're sometimes called clusters. And these regions tend to apply for the federal E-rate funds as consortia, or else give significant support to their members in applying for those funds independently. The average E-rate discount for Minnesota schools is about 70%. We only have in Minnesota, according to the most recent data that I could find, is we've only got 26 of the K-12 school districts, and that's not charter schools and not non-public schools, but 26 of our K-12 districts that do not belong to a telecommunications region. And they usually have a very good reason for that. Either there's been a fiber ring built around their community, or a local provider is giving them such advantageous pricing that it doesn't suit them to join a telecommunications region. But the purpose of the regions is really to aggregate demand and cooperatively purchase capacity. So, and then also to provide some efficiency to these wide area networks, so that the districts and the libraries that are involved in them get appropriate support, very good return on their investment in terms of bandwidth pricing, and then also very stable internet access and connections. And there is on the slides that we've provided, there's a link here to a map of the Minnesota Education Telecommunications Network, of which we officially have about 15, although they range in size from 3 school districts all the way up to regions that serve as many as 70 or more. Okay, so it just depends on the area of the state you're in and how those are put together. In terms of connectivity for Minnesota schools, schools are seeing rapid bandwidth demands increasing every year. More and more we're seeing schools moving to one-to-one initiatives, which means devices being provided to students. Bring your own device initiatives in which students are encouraged to bring laptops, tablets, phones, etc. from home to use for educational purpose. Sometimes it's a combination of both in a school. We're also seeing a lot of growth in digital resources, so schools developing and or accessing educational resources online in preference over purchasing more traditional print textbooks. We're using a lot of multimedia educational content in K-12 education and a lot of project work for students that involves global projects connecting around the world, and also we do in Minnesota definitely have a lot of distance learning going on as well, using both traditional interactive television systems and also other forms of desktop video conferencing. We are working, K-12 education and libraries are working with the Office of Broadband Development in particular to gather some detailed information with the Office of Broadband Development on the levels of bandwidth currently available in Minnesota schools. For Minnesota schools, it's often not a question of there not being the bandwidth available, but whether they can afford, how much of an increase they can afford. The Office of Broadband Development, working with an organization called Education Superhighway, is also looking at the national goals that have been publicized by the FCC and the State Education Technology Directors Association, or SETA, for the coming 2 school years of 100 meg per 1,000 students and staff for this last school year, but working up to 1 gig per 1,000 students and staff for 2016-2017. In Minnesota, most of our districts, because they're members of the regional telecommunications organizations, are part of shared networks, and so that's one of the reasons that it can be difficult to gather data on what's specifically available for each individual school building, because they're drawing from a shared pool of bandwidth, and their usage varies depending from every day, depending on what they're doing in the school, what's going on, whether they've got statewide testing going on, whatever factors are going on in the educational setting. And libraries, Jen, go ahead.
Thank you, Mary. I have to give a disclaimer right off the top here that I am not the technology person in the room, so I don't have the depth that any of my colleagues have, so I would defer any questions on that to these folks. Did want to provide, for those of you who may not be familiar with Minnesota's public libraries, we're fortunate in the state that we have at least one public library location in every county, so we're very widespread that way. A total of 356 public library locations, everything from a very small, essentially one-room building that probably has a restroom, to large facilities that can, I think we've got one in Hennepin County that the building itself has over 500 public access computers, so we've got a wide range available there. In terms of E-rate and telecom, Minnesota is organized into 12 public regional library systems. As Mary mentioned, with the collaboration that happens within the schools, public libraries often work with their telecom cluster to do their E-rate application. So I would estimate that about half of Minnesota's libraries are in collaboration and part of those telecom clusters and receiving internet access and their services through that mechanism. We have another, again, approximately half of the libraries that are applying for E-rate and working through it as independent entities. And one of the consequences, perhaps, of that is we see a very wide variation in costs across the state, which is something I'd love to see kind of even out a little bit. About 92% of the public libraries in Minnesota do participate in the E-rate program. It's a little higher than I actually expected when I looked at the numbers, but that's okay. And the average E-rate discount is about 71%. I'm not sure how that may change with rules changes with the modernization order, but that's where we were at last year. In terms of connectivity, just a couple of facts and figures from our 2014 data, which we're just about to put out. 94% of public libraries that actually currently offer Wi-Fi access, which is a nice number and really tells me that there's a lot of interest in libraries, regardless of where the support is available financially, to really providing this as a service, as a way to expand their capacity to serve their people. One of the chart that you see up here is looking at the Category 6 wiring within the library as well as fiber optic to the building. And you'll see that there's been a substantial increase in the fiber optics to the building over the last couple of years. I'm not sure if that's a trend that will continue or not. Numbers a little bit difficult to work with because of the way libraries are organized in terms of individual buildings versus headquarters, but just to give you an idea of what that looks like. Over the years, the last couple of years, Minnesota libraries have been fortunate to participate in a couple of the BTOP projects that brought increased connectivity up in the Arrowhead region, for example. I think about 22 maybe of their 30-something libraries were actually involved in a project that brought fiber, and they're sharing 100 megs between them. So really looking, and a lot of those are very small libraries that would not otherwise have the capacity, I'm guessing, to build out. Looking at the speeds available in libraries, we've also seen growth since 2012 in the number of libraries that are offering 10 megabits or more of download and upload speed. That slide on the left-hand side there, you can see there's really been kind of a role reversal, if you will, in terms of connectivity. Libraries are really bolstering and boosting that up a little bit. The upload speed, of course, is a little bit different picture. I should also give a disclaimer that while we ask this question on our standard reporting for libraries, libraries can choose not to answer it, so this isn't a pool of each library, but those who chose and were able to answer the question. The trend, though, that I'm clearly seeing is that there are increases happening on a pretty deliberate and consistent way. We know that public libraries are maybe one of the few organizations in many communities, particularly in rural areas, that actually provide public access computers to people. So not just the connectivity, but the devices. And that is actually, the numbers available have stayed very stable over the last few years. I was chatting with my staff member and realizing that I'm guessing a lot of these people are on 3-year leases, so that when those leases are up, we're going to see a little bit of an increase in what's available as people start to be able to expand what they're doing. More than 5 million internet sessions in 2014, and again, this isn't a full count because some people don't count the number of internet sessions, but that's, for the numbers people out there, that's one internet session for every resident of Minnesota used the public library is one way to think about it. So it's very, clearly the libraries are continuing to be a very important resource in many communities for providing access, not just to library resources, but to government resources, e-government, and that sort of thing. And as you can well imagine, having adequate levels of connectivity is super important for being able to, people to fill out a job application, an online form for government aid, and that sort of thing. Mary and I are going to switch off a little bit here.
So in terms of state funding for this purpose, there's a program for schools called Telecommunications Internet Access Equity Aid, and some people call it TEA for short, Telecommunications Equity Aid. And the purpose of that fund is to help schools with the ongoing costs of internet access after the ERate discount has been applied. The program is funded at $3.75 million per fiscal year, and currently it's because of the increases in bandwidth and the growing demand we have had, the state funding is prorated at 43%, which means it falls far short of helping schools cover the remaining bills that are due for their internet access after they've applied their E-rate discounts. The vast majority of K-12 districts in the state apply for E-rate discounts, and there are many charter schools that also do so. and many non-public schools that also do so, but the charter schools and independent or non-public schools tend to do that independently on their own for the most part. Districts who are in telecommunications regions have a funding advantage when it comes to the state funding, because if you notice the word equity in the Telecommunications Internet Access Equity Aid, that program was built into legislation to help schools, particularly who were in areas where the cost of Internet access ran higher, which, as you can imagine, tended to be in rural areas where there was less competition and between telecommunications providers, and other areas where the schools were located at a far distance from the provider. So that last mile cost can become a very heavy financial burden for them to bear. So when a district is in a telecommunications cluster, they are eligible to have up to 100% of their costs after ERate reimbursed for any things that are eligible under the fund. However, because we're prorated at 43%, districts are still picking up the remainder of the cost after that 43%. Districts who are not in the telecommunications regions are also eligible for telecommunications equity aid. However, because they are going out on their own to procure Internet access, and in the view of the legislators that created the program, are not engaging in some of the efficiencies and effectiveness of being in the cooperative situation, they are only eligible for reimbursement for costs that occur after ERate and that exceed $16 per pupil. So the majority of schools in this situation, their costs don't reach that level, and they therefore kind of zero out on the telecommunications aid. Jen, you can talk to the libraries.
Thank you, Mary. So for libraries, there is a regional library telecommunications aid program. It is funded at $2.3 million per year, and the state funds are intended to complement the ERate discounts to fully cover a library's cost for its Internet access. In 2014, the department did put forward statutory changes in order to better align the Regional Library Telecom Aid Program, we call it RLTA, with the changes in ERate to allow more flexibility over time in how libraries would be able to use the funds. The funds support Category 1 ERate services first, so really looking at that Internet connectivity and making sure that that's funded for everybody. We're estimating, this is our first year with it, but we're estimating about 80% of the appropriation will go toward those costs that are connectivity and access related. The remaining funds can be used for Category 2 services. The difference, or the change that we made here from adhering directly to ERate, was to look at the eligible services list going back a couple of years, and knowing that not all libraries are at the cutting edge of what needs to happen, to allow libraries to apply for Category 2 services that were on prior year eligible services lists. So it creates a little bit of a headache in terms of figuring out how we're tracking and monitoring the other statutory criteria, which include cost effectiveness and collaboration. But we've had lots of conversations with folks and think we have some good approaches to ensuring that we meet the intent of the statute, which is for libraries for the fund to cover cost-effective and collaborative telecommunications access, while also not being so limiting that we can't give anything away. So we're really looking forward to seeing how the changes play out. Again, with the changes that ERate's made in terms of Category 2, to really be understanding that the full needs a library has aren't just that connection, but a range of other things that feed into it. So we're looking forward, and hopefully a year from now we'll be able to talk about the different ways in which ERate has been able to help libraries increase their bandwidth and provide faster, better services with more up-to-date equipment for libraries.
And then lastly, we'd like to just give a little highlight to some of the challenges that schools and libraries are facing. Definitely bandwidth demand is growing rapidly and increases each year. Schools are using more and more digital curriculum, as I mentioned before, also a lot of online resources. And with libraries, they are providing access to more and more downloadable digital resources, audio, video, and ebooks as well.
And one of the things we've noticed, looking back at the statistics from libraries over the last years, is that the circulation of e-content is still a fraction of what a library does, but it's increasing exponentially. So we're looking at 20, 30, 40, 50% increases year over year in the use of those resources, which just creates a tremendous demand that is a little bit hard to predict, but is also the way things are going. So we're really trying to help libraries be responsive to that.
Okay. Another challenge that we have is the cost of that last mile is still high in rural Minnesota. It's lower than it used to be, but it still can be a fairly high cost burden for school districts and libraries in the rural areas. Sharing connections with entities that are not eligible for E-rate, so for example, a city or a county or maybe a local business, is still very awkward or sometimes prohibited under the E-rate program. At a minimum, a district, if they're going to share with a county or something like that, they have to cost allocate out their portion of the cost and their use of the internet access and the internet fiber network, whatever it might be. And that can sometimes be very difficult to do. Students, a big issue in Minnesota, while we still want to get fiber out to all of our schools and libraries, another issue we have, though, is we may have fiber into the school district or the school community, but not out to the homes in that area. And so while we're expecting our students to be able to access digital resources constantly, it gets really difficult when they go home and they either have a very slow connection or no connection at all. So that's something that we struggle with in our rural areas as well. The boundaries between schools, school districts, and libraries are different, which sometimes also can create a barrier for sharing connectivity. And then Jenna, let you speak to that last one for the need for persistent
for the non-technical person. I think another challenge I would add to what Mary's listed is directly related to the issue of Wi-Fi. We know that there are library buildings that turn off their Wi-Fi when the building closes. They may have concerns about security with people congregating outside the building or in dark spaces that can't be easily patrolled, looking for safety, being concerned about safety. So that's one thing that I always keep in mind. Wi-Fi feels like in some ways it can be a panacea, but it's really not in many areas of the state. I think what we're seeing in public libraries in particular is that constant need for training and support, both with folks who walk in off the street and have an immediate need, as well as those who want to build their skills in order to be able to compete for jobs and educational opportunities and that sort of thing. And that creates a tremendous demand on libraries who are there, they're available. We're the one who's open on the weekends. We're, not asking people for an ID when they walk in the building. So that does create some challenges for a library in order to serve that need, because we do want people to be educated, to have that level of digital literacy that they need in order to be a member of society the way society is conceived of today. So that just creates a challenge and a dilemma of sorts, because libraries, the wonderful thing about libraries is we don't turn people away. Challenging thing about it is how do we accommodate the increased demand and needs for that. So.
And there's our contact information, but I think any of us are open to questions now.
Yeah, we're kind of hit the hour mark. I think that's okay. If anybody has any last questions, I know Mary has posted that. I think probably the best way is to type it into the chat. I guess the only questions that I have is kind of taken a little bit from your last slide, and this might be actually more a question for Joe or maybe for all of you, but I know when I used to sit, I was a librarian, when I sat on the reference desk and was kind of knew a lot about broadband, people would ask me about that, sharing the connection with entities that are not eligible for E-rate, and that used to be a huge roadblock But it sure feels like so many of the changes of recent have minimized those roadblocks. I don't know if you can say to what degree, or what the libraries can be doing, or what providers can be doing differently to make that easier.
So let Jonathan talk a little bit more about this, but you know, the world has changed, I think, a little bit since those. So I know of several libraries across the country that leave their Wi-Fi networks on at night and allow folks from the community. I doubt if you'll ever see the ERate program or the FCC try to enforce a cost allocation for that type of access. I will tell you, though, that the cost allocation rules for the dark fiber options are really in favor of the service provider deploying more infrastructure deeper into rural America. So, for example, the cost allocation rules, let's go with a district that's decided to do a self-build. You know, in Minnesota, there's probably, at best estimate, somewhere around 80% of your schools are served by fiber today. But I would imagine, and Mary would be able to speak to this more, that when you go into certain districts, there are probably some schools, there's a mix of technology serving those schools, and they've been looking for a way to serve those last 4 or 5 schools with fiber, and there's nothing really in the area. With a self-construction project, the builder, if it's a service provider, can actually put more fibers into the conduit system or up on the pole than what has been paid for. ERate will only pay for the construction in the first 12 strands, but the cost allocation is such that the additional strands are all that would be charged to reach the applicant facility. If the builder wants to build, if the service provider wants to build deeper into the community, beyond the applicant premise, let's say there's an economic development site for the community, or let's say there is a clustered neighborhood around the site, or a cell tower, the builder would be responsible for 100% of the incremental build, so the build beyond the eligible facility. But as you all know on the phone, you know, going from 12 to 96 count fiber is, you know, somewhere in the range of a couple pennies per foot, if that, to go to that incremental. So that's very generous cost allocation. The same with IRU. If you think about an IRU, 4-strand IRU to an applicant facility, you get some nice capital cost recovery with that IRU. It gives you the opportunity as a service provider to build beyond that facility with that capital cost recovery and serve more of the neighborhood. So the cost allocation rules on the dark fiber are very, very attractive to a service provider. And, you know, if I was in the private provider business, I'd be figuring out ways to take advantage of this.
Yeah, just to echo that, this is Jonathan again. I know that's not quite what was meant in that slide about sharing between a library or a school and neighboring community locations, a community center, say, or a business, and we're not going to permit that kind of sharing. That is to say, you know, you've got service to the library and there's a nearby business, and could they somehow set up a link, microwave link or otherwise? Because the program, by statute, is meant to provide this type of discount, this kind of funding to schools and libraries for educational purposes. However, the way Joe just described it is exactly right. We do mean, and I think this is particularly true in rural areas, when you think about getting fiber run to a school or library in a rural area, the planning ought to be broader than just getting to the school or library. And the planning, by that I mean the service provider as well. Either a sort of community broadband build or the service provider build, they ought to be thinking that they can get that fiber paid for largely through ERate, and from there build to other facilities. And so in that way, there's a sharing in that sense. The other point on the last slide, and let me just touch on because I raised it in an earlier meeting that we had, which is gets to the what do you do about school kids who don't have internet access at home, either because the parents can't afford it or because they're in an area where there's no decent internet access. And we are looking at ways to extend that school network for school kids who don't have internet access at home. We full well recognize that for the school itself to be able to engage in digital learning, that unless the entire class, unless the entire population of school kids can do homework at home, you can't really have a curriculum that's designed around the 90% who do have access or the 50% who do have access. I have been looking for a way to run a type of experiment over the coming months for schools or communities that have what's called EBS spectrum, education broadband spectrum, to take the school network, that is to take the 1 gig network that the school has, for example, and to use that after school hours in particular, and use the spectrum and use facilities at its base station to provide services to school kids over the school network when they're off the school campus. Now that would take a waiver of our current cost allocation rules, and possibly the ERate program could pay for some of the equipment. And so I am looking for schools that would like to experiment with a way to provide access, and again, I think this is mostly going to be a rural phenomenon, although I could, it would work in an urban area as well. And work with us over the coming months to, before the next funding cycle for ERate, to see if this kind of thing could work, could be economic, that is, the technology works. This isn't a big deal from a technology standpoint. It's the spectrum that Sprint uses today for a lot of its broadband services, its mobile broadband service, and something that Sprint uses for some implementations of fixed wireless service at homes. So it's not a question of whether does it work, whether the technology works. It's a question of whether the combination of the school network and giving a child an opportunity to have the same experience at home as they have at school. So the same network, same access to resources, same filtering, all of that, and just expanding that network for those kids that don't have access, and whether we could make that work through this spectrum that was designed years and years ago, meant to be for educational purposes, and repurpose that spectrum to be specifically for this kind of purpose. So if people are interested, I guess my contact information isn't up there, but you all could find me.
Check your email right now. Lubbock, Texas.
Well, we can beat Lubbock, Texas.
This is like a telethon. We just had a donation from Lubbock.
That's okay. They got, what do they have, Buddy Holly? We can beat them with this anyway. So.
It's really flat there, though.
Yes, that's true. Well,
there's not a lot of trees.
They've got that. Anyways, we've got
Minnesota's natural beauty.
Our natural beauty always
That's
getting
true.
in our way. Yeah. I want to thank everyone. I know we've gone well over here, but I wanted to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to hear about those opportunities. So thank you, everyone, and I will post this on the Blandin blog as soon as I can, and I can post everybody's contact information there as well. So thank you, Mary.
Well, thank you, Ann, and thanks to Jonathan, Joe, Mary, and Jennifer for joining us on the webinar today. And special thanks to our co-sponsor, the Minnesota Office of Broadband, for helping make this webinar possible. Our next webinar will be Thursday, October 8th from 3 to 4 p.m., and the topic is yet to be determined. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.